Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snoozy Voyager, and tonight we are doing something a little different. Tonight we are not talking about suffering. We are not talking about leeches or plague, or sleeping next to a goat for warmth. Tonight we're going to the top, the absolute glittering, champagne-soaked, cashmere-draped top. Tonight, you are rich. You're not just rich, you're the richest man in 1920s Las Vegas, which, yes, sounds glamorous, and parts of it genuinely are, but also, and I cannot stress this enough, Las Vegas in the 1920s is not the Las Vegas you are picturing right now. There is no Bellagio, there is no buffet with 73 types of shrimp, there is no air conditioning, there is barely a sidewalk. So before you get too comfortable in that imaginary penthouse, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. A special thank you to everyone who suggested a Roaring Twenties episode. You beautiful, historically curious people. I see you. Let's just sit with a few questions for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to be obscenely wealthy in a town that was barely a town? What did the richest man in 1920s Las Vegas actually do all day? Because there were no slot machines yet, no casinos in the modern sense, no showgirls in sequins. What did he eat for breakfast when the nearest grocery store was a 4-hour drive through the Mojave Desert? Did he wear a full three-piece suit in 110-degree heat just to look important to a population of roughly 2,000 people? What happened when he needed a doctor, a lawyer, or someone who wasn't related to half the people in town? Could you survive the dust storms, the railroad politics, the prohibition whiskey, and the very real possibility that your business partner was also your enemy and also your neighbour, and also the man who sold you your boots? And what exactly does power look like when the city you're ruling over is still mostly sand? Congratulations, you have just woken up in Las Vegas, Nevada. The year is 1922. You're wearing linen trousers and your boots are already full of dust. You are, by every measurable standard, the most influential person in this sun-blasted, ambitious, slightly unhinged little corner of the American West. And your day is just beginning. Let's start at the beginning, the very beginning of your day, which arrives not with the gentle chime of a phone alarm or the soft click of a coffee maker, but with a rooster who has absolutely no concept of mercy, followed immediately by sunlight so direct and aggressive it feels less like morning and more like a personal challenge from the Mojave itself. You open your eyes inside the finest bedroom in Clark County, Nevada, which, to be clear, is still a room with wooden walls, minimal insulation, and a window that faces directly east as if whoever built this house actively wanted you to suffer. Your bed is legitimately good. You have a proper mattress, cotton sheets, and a pillow that did not come from a barn. That's the rich part. The rest of it, the heat already gathering in the corners of the room, the sound of horses outside, the faint smell of dust that has been baked into every surface since approximately forever, that's the 1920s Las Vegas part. You lie there for exactly 30 seconds before accepting that sleep is over, that the day has begun, and that you, the most powerful man in this territory, must now get up and deal with all of it. The rooster, for the record, belongs to your nearest neighbour, a rancher named Clarence, who lives close enough that you can hear his livestock, but far enough away that complaining about them would require a level of pettiness that you have not yet descended to. You have considered purchasing the rooster. You have considered purchasing Clarence's entire property and relocating the bird to a distant part of the acreage, where it would disturb no one you know. You have not done this yet, but the morning is young. You sit up slowly, because sitting up quickly in this heat is an act of optimism that your body stopped endorsing around 1917. The room is already warm, not the polite warmth of a summer morning in a sensible climate, the specific, deliberate warmth of a room that has been heated by a desert sun through thin wooden walls and is now informing you, without apology, what the rest of the day is going to feel like. You have lived in Nevada for long enough to know that this is not the worst of it. This is actually the best part of the day, temperature-wise. The fact that this is the best part should tell you something. You stand, you walk to the window and look out at your property, which extends further than you can see from this vantage point, and which is already shimmering slightly at the edges where the morning heat is beginning its daily project. Your horses are moving in the corral. The handyman is already in the yard doing something to a fence post with the focused energy of a man who knows it will be too hot to do this by 10 o'clock. A hawk is circling lazily above the scrubland to the north, which means the morning wildlife assessment is running on schedule. You pour water from the pitcher on your dresser into the basin beside it. The water is cool but not cold, Because ice is not a thing you have unlimited access to in the Nevada desert in summer, regardless of your net worth. You wash your face. You look at yourself in the mirror. You are, by 1920 standards, a man in reasonable physical condition, which means your back hurts in a specific way that has become so familiar it no longer qualifies as news, and your hands show the evidence of 2 decades of work in a climate that is unkind to skin. But your eyes are clear. Your expression is settled. You look like a man who has things under control, which is, when you think about it, mostly what being powerful actually requires. You get up in this town every morning and the town notices. Not because anyone is watching, though someone is usually watching, but because in a place this small, the rhythm of the most important man's day sets a kind of tempo for everyone else's. When your lights come on in the morning, Clarence's ranch hand knows it's time. When your horse is saddled, the man at the mercantile starts unlocking the front door. Power in a small town is not about armies or declarations. It is about being the clock that everyone else quietly sets their watch by. The rooster, somewhere in the middle distance, goes off again. You are already dressed. Now that you're vertical, let's talk about where you actually live. Your home is, without question, the grandest structure in the Las Vegas Valley. It has 2 full stories, a wraparound porch, glass windows that were shipped in at considerable expense from Salt Lake City, and a parlour that contains an actual upholstered settee. People in town have opinions about that settee. Some admire it, some consider it excessive. One man reportedly walked past your house just to look at it through the window, and then went home and told his wife about it over dinner. You are aware of this. You consider it a compliment. The house has 6 rooms, which makes it cavernous by 1920s Nevada standards. It has a wood-burning stove in the kitchen, a separate dining room that you use mainly to conduct business meetings over meals, and a study where you keep your ledgers, your correspondence, and a bottle of whiskey that you will claim is medicinal if anyone official asks. There is no indoor plumbing in the way you might define indoor plumbing. There is a pump. You have made peace with the pump. The house was built in 1913, 9 years ago, on a plot of land you selected specifically because it had a small natural rise on the northern side that would eventually allow for a view of the valley as the town grew. The view has developed precisely as predicted. You find this satisfying in a way that is difficult to explain to people who have not spent years making long bets and waiting for them to land. The construction took 8 months and involved materials shipped in from 3 states, a crew of 12 men, one significant argument about the staircase width that you eventually won, and a total expenditure that caused a banker in Salt Lake City to clear his throat audibly during the wire transfer. It was worth it. Not because the house is comfortable exactly, comfortable is relative, and in a desert climate with no air conditioning, comfort is a negotiation rather than a state, but because the house communicates something that cannot be communicated any other way. It says that you intend to stay, that this is not a temporary arrangement, not a speculation with an exit strategy, not a venture you will abandon when things get difficult. The house says you have committed to this specific patch of Nevada in a way that goes beyond finance and into something closer to identity. The parlour, where the legendary settee resides, is your public room, the space where visitors form their first impression of your household and where you have arranged things accordingly. There is a bookshelf containing volumes that you have actually read, which distinguishes it from most bookshelves maintained for appearance. There is a side table with a lamp. There is a framed map of Clark County on the wall, with certain annotations that visitors occasionally ask about and that you describe, with perfect honesty, as property notes. The settee is blue. It came from a furniture maker in Denver. It survived the journey in better condition than the man who transported it. Your study is different. Your study is functional, not decorative. A desk, 2 chairs, your files, your correspondence rack, and the window that looks out toward the rail line a mile to the east. From this window, you can see the smoke from trains before you can hear them, which gives you approximately 4 minutes of advance notice that is occasionally useful in ways that are difficult to categorize. The whiskey lives in the bottom drawer of the desk. It has company in the form of a revolver, which is also not something you advertise, and which you have not had occasion to use in 7 years, and which you nonetheless check every evening the way other men check their pocket watches. Habit and caution are, in the end, the same thing wearing different clothes. The house in summer traps heat in its upper story like a deliberate experiment. You sleep with the window open and a ceiling fan rotating at its maximum setting, which moves the air with a kind of resigned efficiency, as if the fan knows it cannot fix the fundamental problem but is doing its professional best. The lower story is better. Adobe construction on the rear of the house keeps 2 rooms cool until mid-morning, which is where your housekeeper spends most of her working hours, correctly identifying the climate-controlled real estate and defending it with the quiet territoriality of someone who has earned it. This is your house. It is the best house in the valley. It has a pump, not a tap, and the upper floor is a sauna by noon, and the windows were extremely expensive and are still drafty in a wind. And you would not trade it for anything in Salt Lake City, because it is yours, and because everything you can see from the front porch is also, in one way or another, yours. That is the thing about being the richest man in a small town. The town is a little bit yours in ways that no deed can fully capture. You're the richest man in town, and in 1920s Nevada, that means one thing above all else. You must look like it, at all times, in all weather, regardless of the fact that the weather is actively working against you. Getting dressed is not a casual act. It is a considered, deliberate performance that begins with a proper undershirt, moves through a starched collar that your housekeeper has pressed with an iron heated directly on the stove, and ends with a 3-piece suit in a fabric that was not designed for desert climates by anyone who had ever visited a desert. The jacket goes on last. You button it fully because an unbuttoned jacket suggests a man who has given up, and you have not given up. You have, however, developed a very specific and permanent relationship with perspiration that no amount of wealth has been able to resolve. Your boots are polished, your pocket watch is wound. You check your reflection in the small mirror by the door, and the man looking back at you is composed, prosperous, and already slightly too warm. Perfect. You are ready. The town is not ready for you. But then, the town is never quite ready for you. That is more or less the point. Your wardrobe is the finest in Clark County, which is a statement that requires some contextual calibration. You have 4 suits, proper ones, made to measure by a tailor in Salt Lake City who visits Las Vegas twice a year, and takes your updated measurements with the solemn professionalism of a man who understands that your continued patronage is funding his children's education. The suits are wool and linen in colours that suggest authority without announcing it. Dark grey, deep navy, a brown so rich it reads almost burgundy in certain light. You rotate them with the care of someone who understands that in this climate, a suit can go from pristine to ruined with the committed application of one long afternoon. The collar is the particular battleground. Detachable collars were the standard in 1922, a small linen band that attaches to your shirt with collar studs and presents to the world a crisp, clean edge at your throat, suggesting a man of order and intention. They are also, in 100-degree heat, something approaching a mild instrument of torture. By midday your collar has experienced the full range of a Nevada summer. You change it when you can. You endure it when you cannot. This is the fundamental discipline of being a well-dressed man in the desert, the willingness to suffer cosmetically in service of the impression. Your boots are the one item of clothing that actually makes sense for this environment. Leather, high-ankled with a slight heel, practical by the standards of a man who spends time on horseback and on the unpaved streets of a growing desert town, but polished to a shine that signals you're not a man who works with his hands, or rather, that you are a man who used to work with his hands and has now graduated to working with his presence. The distinction is important. The boot shine is the argument. You own a hat, a proper felt hat with a brim wide enough to deflect the direct assault of the Nevada sun. It spends most of its time on a hook by the front door. You put it on when you leave the house, and take it off when you enter any room, because manners cost nothing and communicate everything. The hat has been replaced twice since you arrived in Nevada. The first one was lost in a dust storm in 1916. The second developed a structural failure along the brim that could not be repaired with dignity. The current one is in excellent condition. You intend to keep it that way. The pocket watch goes in the left vest pocket, chain looped through the buttonhole. It was your father's, and it keeps perfect time, and you have had it serviced by a watchmaker in Los Angeles, who receives it by mail and returns it with a note confirming that nothing is wrong with it. You check it the way other men check their breathing, constantly, unconsciously, with the satisfaction of a system functioning as designed. You step out of your bedroom and onto the landing, fully assembled. From below, the smell of coffee reaches you, your housekeeper's opening argument that the day is worth engaging with. She is, as usual, correct. You descend the stairs in a house that is the best house in the valley, dressed better than anyone within 100 miles, heading toward coffee and whatever the day has decided to bring. The morning has barely begun. The suit is already warm. You button the jacket anyway. You do not eat breakfast alone. In fact, you have not eaten a meal alone in approximately 3 years, because in a town this small, every table you sit at becomes, within minutes, a forum. Your housekeeper, a formidably efficient woman who has worked for you since you first arrived in Nevada, and who runs your household with a precision that would make a military general feel slightly inadequate, has laid out a proper breakfast: eggs from your own chickens, bread baked this morning, cured bacon from the ranch outside of town, and coffee that is strong enough to be considered a structural material. It is genuinely excellent. This is one of the underrated privileges of being the wealthiest man in a small town. You eat very well because you can afford to bring in the good supplies, and because the people who cook for you take considerable pride in the fact that they cook for you. Halfway through your eggs, a knock at the front door introduces your first visitor of the morning, and just like that, breakfast is also a negotiation. The first visitor this particular morning is a man named Harold, who manages one of your freight contracts and who has appeared at your breakfast table 4 times in the past 2 months, each time with a problem of escalating complexity. You have begun to suspect that Harold is not simply an unlucky manager, but a man who generates problems the way other men generate small talk, automatically. Without apparent effort or awareness, you gesture to the chair across from you. Your housekeeper, without being asked, brings a second cup of coffee. She has met Harold before. Harold's issue this morning concerns a shipment of dry goods that arrived at the depot 3 days late, which has caused a cascading inconvenience for 2 of your retail accounts, who were counting on inventory that did not appear when expected. This is not a catastrophe. It is an annoyance that has been translated in Harold's telling into something approaching a regional crisis, partly because Harold experiences all problems at maximum volume, and partly because he is hoping you will be angry enough at the railroad to absorb his share of the responsibility. You are not angry at the railroad. You are mildly irritated at Harold. You eat your eggs while Harold explains. You have learned that eating through a difficult conversation projects a specific kind of authority. The message being that this situation, while being attended to, does not merit the suspension of your meal. You ask 2 clarifying questions. You make 1 decision, which involves a phone call to the depot manager with whom you have a working relationship that has been cultivated across 7 years and numerous well-timed courtesies. The decision takes approximately 45 seconds. Harold seems simultaneously relieved and slightly deflated, having built this encounter up in his mind to a dramatic scale that the actual resolution has failed to match. After Harold departs, you finish your coffee in the brief, genuine quiet that follows. The dining room is the nicest room in the house after the study. A long table, 6 chairs, a sideboard that came from a family that left Nevada during the difficult years after the 1910 flood and sold their furniture at a price that reflected their urgency. You've always been slightly uncomfortable about that particular purchase. You're not comfortable enough to feel bad about it in a sustained way. Breakfast, in this house, is also where you receive your assistant's daily briefing, a concise verbal summary of the day's appointments, correspondence requiring responses, and any developments in town that have occurred since the previous evening. Your assistant is 24, works with the earnest intensity of someone trying to justify his salary, and delivers these briefings with a quality of organised clarity that you find genuinely valuable. You occasionally tell him this, not often enough to make him overconfident, but regularly enough that he has not yet accepted any of the quiet overtures from the bank in Reno that has been trying to recruit him for the past 8 months. You know about the Reno bank's overtures. Of course you do. You know most things that happen in this town before they are brought to your attention, because when you are the centre of a small system, information drifts toward you the way dust drifts toward the lowest point in a room. You have not mentioned it to your assistant. You have, however, given him a salary increase. This is the management philosophy of a man who understands that loyalty is a market, and that the wise investor does not wait until the competing bid arrives. You push back from the table. The day has officially begun. Let's talk about the actual source of your fortune, because this is 1922 in Nevada, and the answer is not one simple thing. It is several things, some of which are entirely legitimate, some of which exist in a legal grey area the size of the Mojave, and at least one of which involves a gentleman's understanding with certain individuals who transport goods through the state at unusual hours. You have land, a significant amount of it, acquired in the early 1910s when Nevada real estate was priced like a polite suggestion rather than an actual asset. You have a general mercantile operation that supplies most of the town. You have a stake in the railroad freight contracts, which is where the real money moves. And you have, let's call it, an arrangement with the distribution of beverages that are technically illegal under federal law since Prohibition began in 1920, but which are, in practical terms, available to anyone in Clark County who knows which door to knock on. Everybody knows. Nobody says it directly. This is the social contract of 1920s Nevada, and you have honoured it faithfully. The land came first. You arrived in Nevada in 1904 with enough capital to make a few careful purchases in a territory that most investors in larger cities hadn't yet bothered to think seriously about. Nevada, after the silver boom of the late 1800s, was not a fashionable investment destination. It was considered played out, overworked, and fundamentally hostile to the kind of agricultural wealth that sustained other Western territories. You disagreed. Not loudly, you have never done anything loudly, but with your checkbook, which is the most durable form of opinion available. The mercantile came second. You opened it in 1907 as a practical necessity. There was no reliable general store in Las Vegas at the time, and the nearest substantial supply point was a significant journey by horse or wagon. A town needs goods. Goods need a place to be sold. You provided the place, at fair prices and with reliable inventory, and within 18 months you had more business than you could comfortably manage alone. You hired staff. You expanded the stock. You cultivated supplier relationships in Salt Lake City and Los Angeles that allowed you to bring in items that no other establishment in the valley could source. This is how you became essential, not through force, but through function. The railroad contracts followed from the mercantile, because once you were moving enough volume through the depot that the freight managers knew your name, the logical next step was to formalize the relationship in ways that were mutually beneficial. You have 3 freight contracts currently, 2 for regular goods, and 1 for a category of cargo that is logged under the description of agricultural supplies, which is accurate in the way that many things are accurate, technically, given the appropriate amount of creative goodwill. The Prohibition arrangement is the one you would most prefer not to discuss in print, if print was something you had to worry about, which in a town of 2,000 in 1922 you decidedly do not. The 18th Amendment became law in 1920. The Volstead Act defined its enforcement. Nevada is a large, sparsely populated state with an insufficient number of federal agents, and an excess of desert terrain that rewards people who know how to move through it quietly. The whiskey that arrives at certain locations in Clark County travels a route that begins somewhere in the mountains to the north and ends at establishments whose proprietors are grateful, discreet, and reliable about payment. You're not the transporter. You're not the producer. You're the man who ensured the infrastructure existed and who receives, in acknowledgement of this service, a margin that is never discussed by anyone within range of being overheard. This is your fortune, not a single dramatic score, not a lucky mine claim, not an inheritance, but 20 years of compounding decisions, each one small and sensible, each one building on the last, in a place that most people looked at and saw nothing, and that you looked at and saw a city that didn't exist yet. Las Vegas in 1922 is not a city. It is a town, and not a large one. A few thousand people arranged around a railroad stop in the middle of the Mojave Desert, surviving on a combination of agriculture, rail commerce, and sheer stubbornness. There are a handful of shops along Fremont Street, a post office, several churches that maintain a cautious diplomatic relationship with each other, a small school, and a number of establishments that serve purposes that are not always listed on their signs. And overseeing all of it, informally, without a title or an election, through the simple gravitational force of owning the most property, employing the most people, and knowing the most secrets, is you. You did not set out to run a town. You set out to make money in a place where land was cheap and ambition was portable. The running of the town happened gradually, the way most things happen in Nevada, quietly, practically, and without a lot of paperwork. Fremont Street in 1922 is not paved. This is worth stating directly, because when you picture the main street of a place that will one day be famous for lights visible from space, the baseline image in your mind is probably not a dusty, unpaved track with horses tied to wooden rails outside a general store. And yet, Fremont Street is dusty, unpaved, and heavily patronized by horses. The boardwalks on either side are wooden, uneven in places, and produce a characteristic sound underfoot that varies between solid and concerning. When it rains, which is not often, but is spectacular when it happens, Fremont Street becomes temporarily impassable by anything that isn't waterproof to the knee. You have lobbied for paving on 3 separate occasions. The county has responded with the enthusiastic supportiveness of a bureaucracy that is thinking about it. The town has a mayor, technically, and a town board, technically, and these are men who meet on a schedule and pass resolutions and maintain the appearance of civic governance with considerable dedication. They're also men who, when a question arises that actually matters, a dispute about water rights, a negotiation with the railroad, a decision about which direction the town's growth should proceed, find their way, through various conversational routes, to your dining room table. This is not corruption, exactly. It is more like a natural settling of organizational weight to its lowest point. You have the resources, the relationships, and the information. The official structure provides the signatures. The arrangement has worked smoothly for years. The school is the thing you are most straightforwardly proud of. You funded half its construction in 1914 and have contributed to its operating costs in subsequent years in ways that you have never publicized and that have been noticed anyway, because in a town this size, anonymous generosity is a category that does not really exist. You have no children of your own, which is a fact about your life that you've organized yourself around without resolving, and the school represents, though you would not say this to anyone directly, something that fills a space in your understanding of why you are here and what your presence in this valley is ultimately for. The establishments on Fremont Street that serve purposes not listed on their signs are a topic that the town handles with a collective social grace that you have always found genuinely admirable. Everyone is aware that several storefronts in Las Vegas are primarily in the business of serving illegal alcohol, providing card games, and offering other entertainments that the law of the land officially prohibits. The law of the land in this specific corner of Nevada in 1922 is enforced with a flexibility that reflects the genuine impracticality of enforcing it fully in a remote desert town where everyone needs something to do after sundown. The sheriff is a reasonable man. You have ensured this by supporting his election campaign on 2 occasions. Reasonable sheriffs do not arrive by accident. The town runs in the end because enough people with enough sense have decided that it should, and because you are the largest node in the network of those people. Not the only node, there are others who matter, who have voices and stakes and legitimate claims on the valley's direction. But the largest, the one that most of the others connect through. In a different era, in a different kind of city, this might be called a political machine or a power structure or a web of influence. In 1922 Las Vegas, it is simply called how things work around here, and it functions with the quiet efficiency of a system that has been running long enough that no one remembers setting it up. If Las Vegas has a heartbeat, it is the Union Pacific Railroad. And if the railroad has a heartbeat in this county, it runs, at least partially, through your ledger books. The railroad is why Las Vegas exists at all. It was a watering stop, then a supply depot, then a proper settlement built around the fact that trains needed to pause here, and people needed to eat and sleep and conduct business while they did. You arrived in Nevada following the railroad money like a very well-dressed compass needle, and you have never once regretted it. Your freight contracts give you influence over what comes into the valley and when. That is not a small thing. In a place this remote, controlling the flow of goods is approximately equivalent to controlling the weather. Everyone is affected by it, everyone has opinions about it, and everyone would like to be on good terms with the person responsible. Your mornings frequently involve some communication with the railroad depot. Your afternoons often continue that conversation. Your evenings occasionally resolve disputes that began because of it. The depot sits at the northern end of Fremont Street, a low building of wood and corrugated metal, shaded on its western side by a water tower that services the locomotives and that represents, if you stand back and consider it philosophically, the single most important piece of infrastructure in Clark County. Without water for the steam engines, trains stop. Without trains, the valley supply chain collapses. Without the supply chain, the town goes the way of every other hopeful settlement that failed to sustain itself in the American desert. You have thought about this chain of dependency many times and have concluded that controlling a freight contract tied to the railroad is the closest thing to controlling gravity that private commerce currently offers. The depot manager is a man named Bert who has held his position for 11 years and who has developed, over that time, a thorough understanding of which arrivals in the Las Vegas Valley are worth noting. He greets the ordinary trains with the professional efficiency of a man doing his job. He greets your shipments with a slightly different quality of attention, which you have never had to request, and which reflects his accurate assessment of which relationships in this county it is useful to maintain. You bring Bert a bottle of something good at Christmas. He ensures your cargo is handled first. This is the economy of small courtesies, and it operates with a reliability that formal contracts cannot always match. The trains run on a schedule that is theoretical in ambition and approximate in practice. The Union Pacific is not an unreliable railroad. It is merely a railroad operating across distances and terrain that would discourage a lesser enterprise entirely. Delays happen. Weather, mechanical issues, scheduling conflicts at larger junctions to the north and west. Any of these can push a delivery by hours or occasionally days. You've learned to build these variables into your planning, which means your inventory timelines account for the possible, and your promises to customers account for the realistic. This practice of building buffer into commitments has served you well across 20 years, and is, if you're honest about it, less a business strategy and more a fundamental philosophy about the relationship between plans and reality. The larger significance of the railroad, the thing that keeps you up occasionally on warm nights thinking about the future, is this. Las Vegas is currently a stop on a line that runs between Salt Lake City and Los Angeles. It is a pause point, a service station for locomotives. But the relationship between the railroad and the valley's future is not fixed. Development follows rails. Where trains go regularly and stop meaningfully, towns grow. Where the railroad commits infrastructure, maintenance yards, expanded depot facilities, additional service capacity, cities eventually appear. You're watching the railroad's investments in this region with the focused attention of someone who understands that those investments are a map of where the money thinks the future is. The railroad also moves people, which is the part of the equation that most of your freight-focused colleagues undervalue. Every person who arrives in Las Vegas by train is a potential customer, a potential employee, a potential investor, a potential problem, or some combination of all four. You've met significant figures in your life in the 15 steps between a train car and the depot door. You've learned that the most useful conversations sometimes begin with a man stepping onto the platform, looking confused about where he is and why he is there, and that the person who greets him first has an advantage that is worth considerably more than the few minutes it costs. This morning, specifically, there is a train arriving from Salt Lake City at 11 that is carrying a man whose correspondence you have been conducting for 4 months, and whose capital you've been courting for investment in a land parcel north of town. The meeting will happen over lunch. The lunch will happen at your table. The outcome is not yet determined, but the setting is controlled, the food will be excellent, and you will be wearing the dark navy suit, which is, empirically, your strongest suit for this kind of conversation. The railroad delivered the opportunity. You intend to close it. Here is the thing about prohibition in a place like 1920s Nevada. It is, in the technical, federal, written down in a constitutional amendment sense, the law. And in the practical, day-to-day, how does anyone actually function sense? It is treated more like a strong suggestion from people who have clearly never spent a summer in the Mojave Desert. You do not drink to excess. You're too careful for that, too aware that a man in your position cannot afford to be seen stumbling out of anywhere. But you do maintain a private stock of very good whiskey, acquired through channels you describe to no one, and you do ensure that certain establishments in town are adequately supplied with spirits for their customers, in exchange for considerations that are documented nowhere and understood by everyone. The sheriff is aware of this arrangement. The sheriff has been a guest at your dinner table on multiple occasions. These two facts are not unrelated. Prohibition became the law of the land on January 17, 1920, via the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act that gave it teeth. The country had been building toward this moment for decades. The temperance movement was a genuine social force, with real arguments and real support, particularly in rural and religious communities who had watched alcohol cause genuine damage to families and communities across the country. You do not dismiss those arguments. You simply observe that the law, as written and as applied to the American West in the 1920s, produces outcomes that its architects did not fully anticipate, and that among those outcomes is an informal economy that rewards people who are organized, discreet, and unbothered by paperwork. The whiskey that circulates in Clark County arrives from producers in the mountains to the north who operate stills on remote properties with the confident invisibility of people who understand that federal agents are not plentiful in Nevada, and that the terrain between here and the nearest federal enforcement office is unforgiving to anyone who doesn't know it well. The product is transported by men who drive at hours and on routes that optimize for not being seen. It arrives at designated points where it is received by people whose official occupations are in other industries entirely, and it is dispensed at modest markups to establishments and private customers who consume it with the guilty pleasure of people doing something forbidden that nearly everyone they know is also doing. You are in this chain several steps removed from the literal handling of illegal spirits, which is where you prefer to be. You provide infrastructure. You provide silence. You provide, on one occasion 2 years ago, a quiet conversation with a county official who was beginning to show signs of inconvenient moral clarity about the enforcement of federal liquor law. The official's clarity did not persist. You consider this one of your more efficient investments. The whiskey in your desk drawer is genuinely excellent. It comes from a source in Kentucky that has been producing bourbon since before the Civil War and that has managed the transition to prohibition with the entrepreneurial creativity of a company that has survived worse. The bottles arrive wrapped in oilcloth inside crates, marked with the designation of a legitimate agricultural product. They are the finest bourbon available in Clark County, possibly in the state, and you share them selectively with people whose judgment and discretion you have verified over time. Prohibition will eventually end. You're fairly confident of this, not because you have specific intelligence, but because laws that are this widely ignored by the populations they govern tend to run into practical problems at scale. When it ends, 1933, though you don't know this yet, the legitimate liquor industry will reshape itself around legal frameworks that will reward people who already have supply relationships, customer bases, and established distribution infrastructure. You have been building those things for 2 years. The whiskey in the drawer is a business investment as much as a personal pleasure. You are, above all else, a man who plans ahead. It is necessary at some point in this journey through your day to speak directly and honestly about the heat, because nothing about 1920s Las Vegas can be properly understood without first accepting that the temperature is a permanent participant in every activity, every conversation, every decision, every meal. It is not background weather. It is a presence. In July, the thermometer sits above 100 degrees before 9 in the morning and does not apologize for this. You do not have air conditioning. Nobody has air conditioning. The technology exists, in rough experimental form, in some industrial buildings in large cities, but it has not arrived in the Nevada desert, and even if it had, it would require infrastructure that does not yet exist here. You have ceiling fans which move the hot air around with a kind of cheerful futility. You have thick adobe walls in the rear portion of your house, which hold the cool of the night for approximately 2 hours into the morning before surrendering. You have a particular chair on the north-facing side of your porch, which receives shade in the afternoon, and you guard access to this chair with the quiet territorial intensity of a man who has run out of other options. The heat of the Mojave is not the polite seasonal warmth of summer in most American cities. It is a fundamental condition of the landscape. The desert is hot in the way that the ocean is wet, as a baseline characteristic rather than a temporary state. The valley floor in July sits at an elevation low enough that the air coming off the surrounding mountains has had time to fully commit to its temperature before it arrives at your front door. And the sun, in a cloudless desert sky, is not filtered or softened by the atmospheric moisture that moderates it in other climates. It arrives direct, personal, with intent. You have adapted, as anyone who survives years in this climate necessarily does, by reorganizing your relationship with the hours of the day. The productive hours are before 10 in the morning and after 4 in the afternoon. The hours between 10 and 4 are endured rather than enjoyed. You keep to shaded interiors, you move slowly and deliberately, you drink water with a seriousness that visitors from wetter climates find startling. You keep a water pitcher on your desk. Your staff keeps water available everywhere. Dehydration in the Nevada desert is not a minor inconvenience. It is a medical event that has ended lives, and you're not interested in becoming a cautionary anecdote. Ice is available in Las Vegas, but at a cost and in quantities that remind you of its scarcity. The Iceman delivers twice a week from an ice house that sources its product from mountain suppliers and manages the transport with insulated wagons of limited efficiency. By the time ice arrives at your kitchen, it has already committed to a career change. Your housekeeper uses it strategically, a block for the ice chest where perishables live, a small amount shaved into drinking water on the most severe afternoons, and the rest managed with the careful rationing of someone who understands finite resources. You have cold drinking water approximately 4 hours a day. You have made peace with warm water for the remainder. You have not entirely forgiven it. Your staff communicates the temperature through a vocabulary that has evolved to accommodate the specific granularity required. Good morning is not merely a greeting, it is an assessment. A good morning, mild, is a genuinely positive development. A warm one acknowledges that the thermometer has already cleared 90 before breakfast. A hot one today, sir, carries with it implications about the afternoon that do not require elaboration. On the days that fall outside even this vocabulary, the days in August when the temperature exceeds 110 and the valley shimmers and the horizon looks like it is slightly melting, there is a particular look that passes between your housekeeper and your cook that communicates everything without words. It is the look of two people who have agreed, wordlessly, not to pretend this is manageable. You have never once complained about the heat to anyone in Las Vegas. This is a deliberate policy. The heat is real, the heat is universal, and complaining about it accomplishes nothing except signaling that you might be the kind of person who finds this place harder than you let on. You're not that kind of person. Or rather, you are. It is genuinely very hot. But you are committed to not performing it. Nevada selects for people who can sit in 108-degree heat and continue their conversation without losing the thread, and you intend to be one of those people until the conversation is finished. You employ, depending on the season and the workload, between 8 and 12 people in your household and immediate business operations, which makes you, by the standards of 1920s Southern Nevada, something approaching an institution. There is your housekeeper, already mentioned, whose organizational capabilities could run a small government. There is a handyman who maintains your property and who has, over 7 years of employment, fixed approximately everything at least once. There is a cook who arrives at 5:30 in the morning and leaves after supper is cleared, and whose biscuits have been described by grown men with tears in their eyes. There is a young man who handles your correspondence and keeps your appointment calendar, and who is smart enough that you're actively trying to figure out how to keep him from moving to Los Angeles. There are stable hands, a part-time bookkeeper, and a woman who launders your clothes and returns them pressed and folded, with a regularity that you have come to regard as one of the great stabilizing forces in your life. Your housekeeper's name is Agnes, and she has been with you since 1913, which means she has been in your employ almost as long as the house has existed. She arrived from Salt Lake City with references from a family you knew by reputation, and she has exceeded those references in every practical dimension. Agnes runs the household on a schedule that is maintained with the kind of discipline that is either admirable or alarming depending on your relationship with structure, and that you find deeply reassuring. Meals are on time, linens are changed on a schedule, supplies are inventoried weekly and replenished before deficits occur. Agnes has, in 9 years, never failed to anticipate a household need before you are aware of it yourself. You pay her more than the going rate for domestic staff in Nevada, because you're not interested in her calculating whether her skills might be better rewarded elsewhere, and because she has earned every cent with compound interest. The cook is a man named Delbert who came to Las Vegas from New Mexico in 1918, and who makes the best pork roast in the territory, and possibly the region. Delbert is quiet, efficient, and deeply territorial about his kitchen, which you respect absolutely. You have learned not to enter the kitchen during active cooking hours except under conditions of genuine emergency. You have learned this because you entered the kitchen during active cooking hours twice in your first year with Delbert, and both occasions produced an atmosphere of such concentrated professional displeasure that you concluded the kitchen was Delbert's domain in the same way the study was yours. You have honoured this arrangement and your meals have been consistently excellent. Correlation is not causation, but it is suggestive. Your handyman, a man of approximately 50 named Walt, is the person who actually keeps the physical infrastructure of your life functional. Walt can fix a pump, mend a fence, repair a roof section, rehang a door that has warped in the heat, service a wagon wheel, and address a plumbing concern with equivalent competence, which makes him either a remarkably skilled generalist or a man who has lived through so many things going wrong that he has simply learned to fix all of them. You suspect the latter and respect it accordingly. Walt's productivity peaks in the early morning before the heat commits itself and slows predictably through the afternoon in ways that you've stopped managing, having concluded that Walt's slow afternoon hour still produces more output than most men's fast morning. Your assistant, the young man you are trying to retain against the gravitational pull of Los Angeles, is named Thomas, and he is 24 years old and from Phoenix, and has been with you for 2 years, and in those 2 years has developed a competence that you find both impressive and slightly inconvenient, because genuinely competent people always have options. Thomas organizes your correspondence, maintains your appointment calendar, takes notes in meetings, and occasionally offers observations about business situations that are more useful than you always admit in the moment, but that you frequently act on subsequently. He has not yet realized the full extent of his own capabilities, which is the only thing currently keeping him from negotiating harder. You're aware of this window and have no intention of being the one who closes it. The rest of your staff, the laundress, the stable hands, the part-time bookkeeper, are people whose names are known in town, whose connection to your household is understood, and whose reliable presence in your employ is itself a form of communication. In a town of 2,000, employing 10 people is not incidental. It means that 10 families have a connection to your operation. 10 households are invested in your stability. 10 sets of relationships extend outward into the community through people who work for you, and who, by simple proximity and loyalty, represent your interests in conversations you're not present for. This is the invisible architecture of influence in a small town, and it is built not through speeches or declarations but through payroll, delivered on time, every week, without exception. Lunch in your world is less a meal and more a mobile negotiation that happens to involve food. You're rarely at your own table at midday. More typically, you're at the counter of the mercantile, or at a table in the back room of a lunch establishment on Fremont Street, or standing in the doorway of someone's office with the sandwich that your housekeeper packed, because she does not trust you to eat otherwise, and she is correct not to trust you. The food itself is good. Generally, you can afford the better ingredients, and the cooks in town know who you are and act accordingly. But you eat quickly, because eating slowly implies you have nowhere to be, and a man in your position always has somewhere to be, even when he is, in fact, exactly where he should be. Lunch is for information as much as sustenance. Whoever sits across from you at midday is usually there because they have something to say or something to ask, and you have learned to distinguish between these two things by the second sentence. Today, lunch is at the back table of an establishment on Fremont Street run by a woman named Viola, who serves food at midday out of a building whose primary evening business is not food. Viola's lunch counter is one of the better-kept secrets of social navigation in Las Vegas. The back table is private enough for a real conversation, and public enough that no one can later claim a meeting didn't happen, which is a distinction that occasionally matters. The menu is written on a chalkboard and changes daily based on what arrived on the morning supply wagon and what Viola's cook has decided to do with it. Today it is a beef stew that smells like someone made a serious decision about it several hours ago, sourdough bread, and a coffee that comes without being asked. The man across from you today is the investor from Salt Lake City, recently arrived by the 11 o'clock train, whose name is Franklin, and whose handshake was confident in the way that suggests either genuine self-assurance or considerable practice at projecting it. You have not yet determined which. Franklin represents a group of investors interested in the land north of town, a parcel of 140 acres with a water right attached that you acquired in 1917 for an amount that seemed at the time extravagant and now seems, with the hindsight of 5 years of valley development, almost embarrassingly reasonable. You let Franklin talk through the first half of lunch. This is technique, not passivity. A man who has just arrived somewhere after a 4-hour train journey has things he wants to establish, his seriousness, his resources, the sophistication of his principles, the terms he considers reasonable. You let him establish all of these things while you eat your stew, which is excellent, and while you form a much more precise picture of what Franklin actually wants, versus what he's been authorized to offer, versus what he would agree to if the conversation arrived at the right moment in the right sequence. By the time the bread is finished, you have identified 3 things. First, Franklin's principles want the water right more than the land itself, which means the land's price is negotiable in ways Franklin has not been authorized to admit. Second, Franklin has a deadline he has not mentioned, which you have inferred from a specific pattern of overemphasis on closing the arrangement before the end of the month. Deadlines that are not disclosed are the most useful deadlines. Third, Franklin likes being treated as someone whose judgment is trusted, which is a leverage point that costs nothing to use and pays well when deployed at the right moment. You order a second coffee. You shift the conversation to Franklin's assessment of the valley's future, which allows him to demonstrate his research and feel respected for having done it. His assessment is reasonable, fairly accurate, and confirms that his principals have been paying attention to Nevada in a serious way for at least 2 years. This is useful information. It means they are not opportunists responding to a rumour. They are committed. Committed investors pay more for certainty than opportunists pay for excitement. The lunch ends with nothing agreed to formally and everything positioned. You shake Franklin's hand at the door of Viola's establishment in the full sun of a Fremont Street afternoon, and you tell him you look forward to continuing the conversation at dinner this evening. Franklin smiles with the expression of a man who thinks the negotiation is going well. He is not wrong. It is going well. It is going well for you. You're the richest man in Las Vegas, but you're not the only ambitious man in Las Vegas, and this distinction matters. There are 2 or 3 other men in town who have means, connections, and the general air of someone who believes they are being underestimated. They are not wrong to believe this. You have, in fact, spent the better part of a decade carefully ensuring that they remain in the position of believing they are almost catching up, while making sure the almost is doing a great deal of structural work in that sentence. One of these men owns a competing general store that does about 40% of your business. One has a ranch that supplies beef to most of the valley. One arrived 3 years ago from Phoenix with a great deal of confidence and a letter of introduction from a banker in Salt Lake City, and you have been watching him with the patient, specific attention of someone who is not yet sure whether this person will be useful or inconvenient. The jury remains out. The man with the competing general store is named Douglas, and Douglas is, if you're being honest with yourself, a reasonable businessman. He runs a clean operation, maintains fair prices, and has cultivated a customer loyalty in the southern part of town that reflects genuine effort rather than geographic monopoly. You do not underestimate Douglas. You did briefly in 1915, and the period that followed was instructive in ways you do not intend to repeat. Douglas's store carries certain goods better than yours. His produce section, specifically, benefits from a supplier relationship with a farm outside of Henderson that you have attempted to replicate and have not quite matched. You find this mildly irritating. It does not keep you up at night. It keeps you attentive, which is more useful. Your approach to Douglas is one of calibrated cordiality. You're pleasant when you encounter him. You attend the same civic functions and stand at a conversational distance that communicates neither alliance nor antagonism. You have referred customers to his store on 2 occasions, once because he genuinely had what they needed and you did not, and once as a deliberate and visible act of generosity that cost you nothing and communicated to the broader town that you are a man who operates from security rather than fear. Douglas received the referrals graciously. You suspect he found them unsettling, though he would never say so. Good. The rancher, a man named Hector, who runs several hundred head of cattle on land east of the valley, is a different category of competition entirely. Hector is not trying to be you. He does not want your position, or your influence, or your relationship with the railroad. He wants to run cattle profitably, which he does, and to be left alone by the county authorities, which he is, and to sell his beef at the best available price, which currently means selling most of it through your mercantile, which gives you a specific kind of leverage that neither of you discusses directly, but that both of you understand perfectly well. Hector is not a rival. He is a supplier who could, if sufficiently motivated or sufficiently courted by someone else, become a complication. You ensure sufficient motivation through fair pricing and prompt payment. It is, in the end, a simple system. The man from Phoenix is named Gerald, and Gerald has money, real money, not local scale money, but the kind that arrives with references from institutions in Chicago. And Gerald has been in Las Vegas for 3 years, conducting what he describes as a survey of investment opportunities, and what you understand to be a careful, unhurried evaluation of whether this valley is worth a serious commitment of capital. You have met Gerald at 6 social occasions and spoken with him at 4 of them in any substantive way. Gerald is smart. Gerald asks the right questions. Gerald has, on 2 separate occasions, asked questions that were specific enough that you concluded he has a source of information about your operations that you have not yet identified. You're looking for that source, quietly, without urgency, because urgency in this kind of search produces mistakes. Gerald is either a future partner, a future competitor, or a future problem, and the category he ends up in will depend on factors that are still developing. You're in no hurry to resolve the question. Patience in the Nevada desert is not a passive virtue. It is an active strategy. Your correspondence is substantial for a man living in a town of 2,000 people, which reflects both the reach of your business interests and the fact that you have spent 20 years cultivating relationships in places larger and more powerful than Clark County, Nevada. Letters arrive from Denver, from Los Angeles, from Salt Lake City, from Phoenix, and occasionally from contacts in Chicago and New York, whose precise occupations you describe in polite company as import and distribution. Your assistant sorts the mail each afternoon into 3 piles, things requiring your immediate attention, things requiring your eventual attention, and things that are someone else's problem that they have mistakenly forwarded to you. The 3rd pile is, with some consistency, the largest. You answer your own most important letters in longhand in the evening, because you are meticulous about communication in a way that most people underestimate, and that underestimation has served you very well. The mail arrives at the Las Vegas post office each afternoon on the 2:15 train, is sorted by a postmaster named Everett who has held the position since 1911 and whose knowledge of who receives correspondence from whom is encyclopedic, carefully maintained, and, you suspect, occasionally shared with people who pay attention to such things. You've never confirmed this suspicion. You've also never sent anything through the Las Vegas post office that you would object to Everett knowing about, which is a precaution that costs nothing and provides a specific kind of security that is difficult to quantify but easy to appreciate. Your assistant collects the mail in the early afternoon and has it sorted on your desk before 3 o'clock. Today's pile is representative of a normal week. There is a letter from your lawyer in Salt Lake City regarding the water rights dispute that has been running for 8 months with a neighbor to the north who believes that a historic water usage claim gives him rights that your documentation says it does not. The lawyer's letter is 4 pages, which means the situation has developed in a direction that requires your attention rather than his independent judgment. You set this aside to read fully this evening. There is a letter from a supplier in Los Angeles regarding pricing adjustments on a category of dry goods that will, if implemented as proposed, compress your margin at the mercantile by approximately 6%. This is a negotiation conducted by mail, which is slow and deliberate and gives both parties time to consider their positions, a format you generally prefer for commercial negotiations, because the absence of a face across the table removes the social pressure to resolve things faster than the numbers support. You will respond in 3 days after your assistant has worked through the relevant figures with a counter-proposal that splits the difference in a way that is favourable to you but not insulting to them. There is a postcard from a man in Denver whose name you recognize as someone you met at a rail conference in 1919, and who sends you occasional notes about developments in the railroad industry, with the cheerful regularity of a man who enjoys corresponding, and who has concluded you are worth corresponding with. The postcard contains a single piece of information about a proposed change to a Union Pacific freight routing that, if it occurs, will affect the timing of your Salt Lake City deliveries by approximately 2 days. You'll follow up on this with a letter to your railroad contact. The postcard is unsigned, as his postcards always are, which is a habit you've never asked him to explain. The remainder of the correspondence is the third pile. A circular from a business association in Phoenix that you are nominally a member of, an invoice that should have gone to the mercantile rather than the house, and a letter addressed to a previous tenant of this property who moved away in 1916 and whose mail still occasionally finds its way here through the combined efforts of postal optimism and outdated directories. You write the man's forwarding address on the envelope and set it aside for remailing. You do this every time. It is a small, consistent, completely unnecessary act of courtesy that you have never stopped doing and that you have never examined for meaning. You close the mail session. You make 2 notes for your assistant about items requiring follow-up. The afternoon is still ahead of you. The heat is doing its committed work, and there is a dinner tonight that requires preparation that has nothing to do with food. You own more land in Clark County than any other private individual, which is a fact that is simultaneously obvious, frequently discussed, and never spoken to your face in a direct way. Because land ownership in the American West in the 1920s is one of those subjects where everyone knows the numbers and no one says them out loud without a reason. You did not acquire this land through a single dramatic purchase. You acquired it the way experienced people acquire things in Nevada. Gradually, opportunistically, in parcels, through trades, through debts settled, through foreclosures on arrangements that did not work out for other parties, and through a few outright purchases when prices were low and other buyers were not paying attention. Some of your land has water rights attached, which, in a desert, elevates it from real estate to something closer to sovereignty. You think about your land the way other men think about their families, with a mixture of pride, worry, and a constant low-level awareness of threats that have not yet fully materialized. The total acreage is a number that you know precisely and that you review quarterly in your ledger with the focused attention of a man reading a document that is also, in some fundamental sense, a map of his own life. The parcels range in size from small in-town lots, some of which contain buildings generating rental income, some of which sit empty and appreciating, to substantial tracts in the valley's northern and eastern reaches that currently support cattle grazing leases, and that you are holding with the specific patience of a man who knows that the value of desert land is not what it is today, but what it will be when the water arrives. Water rights are attached to 4 of your parcels, and these 4 are the ones you would defend most aggressively against any legal challenge, any political pressure, or any creative reinterpretation of existing agreements. Water in the Mojave is not a utility. It is the precondition for everything else, for agriculture, for construction, for habitation, for the basic human activity of remaining alive in a place that will not sustain you without it. A man who owns land in the Nevada desert and also owns the water rights, to that land owns something that is categorically different from land without water. He owns the future of that ground and some portion of the future of whoever needs to be near it. You acquired your first water right in 1908 through a transaction that began as a simple land purchase and that you recognized midway through the documentation contained a water claim that the selling party had not mentioned and did not appear to have noticed. You did not point this out. You completed the purchase. You have spent the subsequent 14 years ensuring that the documentation supporting that right is complete, current, and filed in every jurisdiction that could conceivably have an opinion about it. Your water lawyer, the same Salt Lake City attorney currently engaged on the dispute with your northern neighbor, has described your water documentation as the most comprehensively filed private water claim he has encountered in 20 years of practice. You consider this the most useful compliment you have ever received. The in-town lots are a different category of holding, more liquid, more immediately relevant to the town's daily economy, and more subject to the kind of neighbourly attention that rural parcels escape. You own the lot on which a dry goods competitor operates, which is a fact that the competitor is aware of and that provides a specific texture to the relationship that neither of you has ever felt the need to address directly. The lease terms are fair. They have always been fair. You are not interested in leverage for its own sake. Leverage unexploited is simply a fact of the landscape, and exploiting it unnecessarily would convert an asset into an enemy, which is a trade you have never found attractive. The land north of town, the parcel Franklin arrived this morning to discuss, is the one you're most carefully managing at present. 140 acres on a gentle rise that currently supports nothing more economically significant than scrubrush, and one family of coyotes who have established residency with the confident permanence of squatters who do not read legal notices. If the dam is built, if the construction workforce arrives, if Las Vegas becomes the logistical center for one of the largest infrastructure projects in American history, that land becomes something else entirely. You're not selling it to Franklin's principals at any price that reflects what it is today. You're selling it, if you sell it at all, at a price that reflects what it will be. The negotiation has not yet reached that conversation. It will. Socializing in 1920s. Las Vegas is a peculiar exercise, because the pool of people available to socialize with is limited in size, but remarkably dense in complexity. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone has an opinion about everyone. The 6 degrees of separation that applies in large cities collapses, in a town this small, to approximately 1.5 degrees, which means that the person you said something mildly critical about on Monday has heard a version of it, probably improved in the retelling by Wednesday. You have learned to be careful with your words in public, which for a man of your natural directness requires a specific kind of discipline. Your home is the primary venue for the town's better social events. Dinner parties for 8 or 10 people, occasional larger gatherings on the porch in the cooler evenings of spring and fall, the annual July 4th celebration that has become by default the social event of the local calendar. The July 4th gathering at your property has been an annual institution for 8 years, which means it has now outlasted the marriages of 3 of its regular attendees, the business partnerships of 2 others, and one particularly dramatic falling out between neighbouring ranchers that generated enough social tension for approximately 2 years before resolving itself in the way that most things in small towns eventually resolve themselves, through the simple attrition of proximity and the practical necessity of not maintaining a feud with someone you see at the post office every week. The gathering runs from late afternoon into the evening on the broad porch and extending into the yard, and involves food from Delbert that is implausibly good for an outdoor occasion, lemonade that is served publicly, and a whiskey punch that is served from a secondary table to guests whose reliability you have verified, and a general atmosphere of social ease that you have cultivated deliberately over years. People come because the food is excellent, the company is reliable, and because being invited is understood, without anyone saying so, as a signal about where you stand in the valley's informal social order. Not being invited is also a signal. You have deployed this mechanism twice in your years of hosting, both times with the precision and the slightly uncomfortable satisfaction of a man who is very good at something he wishes he did not have to be very good at. Dinner parties on a smaller scale happen approximately once per fortnight during the spring and fall, less frequently in the brutal months of summer, when the idea of sitting in a formal dining room in three-piece suits, competing with the ambient temperature of a Nevada July, feels less like hospitality and more like a competitive ordeal. The guest lists are curated with the kind of attention that social architects bring to seating charts. Who needs to meet whom? Who should not be placed across from whom? Which combination of personalities will produce a conversation that is useful versus one that is merely entertaining versus one that will have consequences you will spend the following week managing? The women of Las Vegas, whose social world runs in important ways parallel to and intersecting with the men's without being quite the same thing, are a separate and significant force that you have learned to respect with a specificity that surprised you when you first arrived in Nevada. The women who built lives in this desert town did not do so by being decorative. They did so by being tough, resourceful, and socially precise in ways that would be immediately recognizable to anyone who has ever tried to run a complex operation with limited resources. Agnes, your housekeeper, is the most reliable social intelligence source you have in this town, not because she gossips, she does not, but because she pays attention in rooms that you are not in, and because she has worked for you long enough to understand what information is relevant to your interests without being told. The social scene in Las Vegas is small and complicated and full of people who need each other and occasionally can't stand each other and always have to see each other again tomorrow. In a larger city you might find this claustrophobic. Here, you have concluded, it is simply the texture of the life you have chosen, and the richness of that texture, on balance, outweighs the occasional inconvenience of living somewhere that forgets nothing and forgives slowly. In the Mojave Desert in the 1920s, water is not a utility. It is not something you turn on with a tap and forget about. It is a resource with the psychological weight of gold and the political implications of territory. And in southern Nevada, the conversations about water, who has it, who controls it, where it comes from, where it goes, are as serious and as loaded as any conversation about money or land. You have water rights, several of them, attached to parcels of land near the Las Vegas Wash and the artesian wells that made this valley habitable in the first place. These rights are documented, defended, and occasionally disputed by neighbors who believe the documentation is open to creative interpretation. It is not open to creative interpretation. You have ensured this through the retention of a lawyer in Salt Lake City who has read every water statute in the territory with what can only be described as aggressive enthusiasm. The Las Vegas Valley sits atop a groundwater basin that was, for thousands of years before European settlement, known only to the indigenous peoples of the region who had navigated its seasonal availability with an understanding of the land that the arriving settlers learned to approximate imperfectly over decades. The artesian wells that supplied the original Las Vegas ranch, the agricultural operation that preceded the railroad stop that preceded the town, were the foundation on which everything else was built. Without that water, the valley was inhospitable. With it, it was merely very challenging. The distinction was sufficient for the people who chose to stay. Water law in Nevada in the 1920s operates on the doctrine of prior appropriation, a legal framework that awards water rights based on who first put the water to beneficial use and filed the appropriate documentation. First in time, first in right, as the saying goes, which rewards early movers and punishes late arrivals in a way that aligns neatly, if not always justly, with the frontier economics of Western expansion. Your rights are senior, you established them early, filed them properly, and have used them consistently enough to maintain their legal validity. This gives you a position in the valley's water hierarchy that is not easily displaced. The dispute with your northern neighbour, the one your lawyer's letter addressed this afternoon, involves a claim that a historical usage predates your documented right by several years, and that this prior usage, informal and undocumented as it was, should nonetheless take legal precedence. Your lawyer finds this argument creative, not compelling, but creative. The hearing is in 3 months, in the county seat, before a judge who you do not know personally, but whose professional reputation is for methodical adherence to the written record, which is where your case lives comfortably, and your neighbour's does not. Water also connects directly to the larger future you're watching, develop in the canyon country to the southeast. The Colorado River Compact was signed in 1922, just this year, dividing the river's flow among 7 western states. Nevada's allocation is modest but real, and the question of how that allocation will be developed, and by whom, is one that will shape the next several decades of the region's growth. A dam on the Colorado would not just provide power and water for the growing cities of the Southwest. It would require, for its construction, a workforce of several thousand men living in a location near the work site, and the location nearest to where that work site will be, if the surveys and the lobbying and the congressional arithmetic all align, is the Las Vegas Valley. Water, in the end, is the argument that the desert makes against itself and loses. The desert says nothing can grow here, nothing can be sustained, nothing significant can be built. And then someone finds the water, and then someone like you documents the rights to it, and then the argument changes entirely. There is a version of you that exists in the collective imagination of Clark County that is somewhat larger than the actual you, and you have spent years carefully tending to this version the way a gardener tends to a topiary, shaping it, maintaining it, occasionally allowing it to grow in directions that are useful. Your reputation is that of a man who is fair but not soft, generous but not foolish, decisive in ways that other people sometimes only understand in retrospect. People who have worked with you describe you as a man of his word, which in the 1920s, American West is the highest possible professional compliment. People who have worked against you describe you in terms that are less flattering but equally useful, because a reputation for being someone you don't want to cross is, in certain contexts, as valuable as a reputation for being someone you do want to know. Reputation in a small town is a living thing. It breathes. It grows in the telling and changes with the teller, and arrives at destinations you did not send it, carrying details you did not include. A story about something you did in 1915 exists, in 1922, in approximately 11 different versions, several of which have you doing things you definitely did not do, a few of which have you being more admirable than the facts support, and one of which told you suspect by a man you declined to do business with in 1918, casts you as considerably more ruthless than you are, which you have decided, on reflection, to leave uncorrected. The reputation for being a man of your word is the one you've invested in most deliberately, because it is the one that compounds most reliably. every time you honour a commitment under circumstances where honouring it was inconvenient or costly, you deposit into an account that pays returns in the currency of trust. And trust, in a place where legal enforcement of agreements is slow and expensive and geographically complicated, is the primary lubricant of commerce. People do business with you because they believe you will do what you said you would do. That belief, multiplied across 20 years of interactions, is worth more than any single land parcel or freight contract or whiskey arrangement. It is the foundation under everything else. You have violated this reputation exactly once, in 1912, in a business dealing with a man who had misrepresented the terms of an arrangement in ways that became clear after the documents were signed. You acted on the new information in a way that was legally defensible and personally convenient, and that the other man experienced as a betrayal. He left Nevada the following year. You've thought about this transaction on a number of occasions since, not with guilt, exactly, but with the specific discomfort of a man who knows where the edge of his principles is because he has stood close enough to it to feel the temperature change. Your reputation for generosity is real, but carefully bounded. You give to the school, you fund repairs to the church, you have quietly covered the debts of 2 families during hard seasons, in ways that were presented as business arrangements rather than charity, because the families in question had the dignity not to want charity, and you had the sense to offer something they could accept. These acts are known. Everything is known in a town this size, but they are not discussed, which is the precise social outcome you intended. Generosity that requires acknowledgement is not generosity. It is advertising. You have enough of those expenses already. The men who have worked against you, the 2 or 3 in your history who arrived in the valley with ambitions that collided directly with yours and who concluded the collision badly, have contributed to the other layer of your reputation, the one that discourages certain categories of competitive behaviour. You have not done dramatic or violent things to these men. You have simply ensured, through the ordinary mechanisms of business and relationship, that their ambitions encountered more friction in this valley than they expected, and found their best opportunities lay elsewhere. 2 of them left. 1 stayed and found a niche that did not overlap with yours, which was, in the end, the resolution you would have suggested from the beginning if he had thought to ask. Let us gently address the medical situation in 1920s Las Vegas, because even the richest man in the territory is subject to the limitations of what medicine can actually do in a town this remote, and those limitations are significant. There is a doctor in Las Vegas. 1. His name is known to everyone. His waiting room operates on a first-come, first-served basis that does not make exceptions for wealth or status, and his medical equipment, while adequate, was manufactured years before it arrived here, and has been repaired at least once by the handyman at the hardware store. You have a standing arrangement with a physician in Salt Lake City who will see you promptly if you travel the 4+ hours required to reach him, which you have done twice in the past 5 years for matters requiring more sophisticated attention than Las Vegas can provide. Your teeth are, by the standards of the era, in reasonable condition, because you can afford a dentist visit and because you have the genuine dental luxury of a full set of your own. You consider this one of your more reliable blessings. The town doctor is a man named Clarence, a different Clarence from the one with the rooster, because this is a small town and names do double duty, who arrived in Las Vegas in 1916 and who has, in 6 years of practice, seen essentially everything that the desert, poor diet, physical labour, and human carelessness can produce. Dr. Clarence is a competent physician by the standards of his era, which means he can set a bone, diagnose the more obvious infectious diseases, manage a difficult birth with reasonable success, and provide medications that, while limited by modern standards, represent the best available options in 1922. He cannot perform complex surgery. He cannot treat the tuberculosis cases that occasionally appear in the valley with anything beyond supportive care and grim honesty. He cannot do anything meaningful about the influenza that swept through the town in 1918 and took 11 people, including 2 that you knew well, which is the kind of medical helplessness that no amount of wealth or influence can address. You have been to see Dr. Clarence 4 times in the past 5 years. Once for a respiratory infection that lingered through a February. Once when a fence-related incident produced a wound on your forearm that required stitching. You were at the ranch property, supervising a construction project, and made the error of getting involved in a physical way that your position should have precluded. Once for a consultation about a persistent pain in your lower back that Dr. Clarence diagnosed as the cumulative consequence of 20 years of hard living in a challenging climate and for which he prescribed rest, which you received with the specific frustration of a man for whom rest is not a practical recommendation. And once for something that you have not discussed with anyone, and that resolved without requiring the Salt Lake City physician, for which you remain quietly grateful. The dentist visits twice a year, a traveling practitioner who arrives from Las Vegas's nearest substantial neighbor on a schedule that he maintains with impressive regularity for a man whose practice involves a horse-drawn wagon, a portable chair, and equipment that you try not to look at too directly before it is deployed. He is competent, swift, and businesslike, which are the qualities you most want in a person performing dental work with the tools of 1922. Your teeth have required 2 extractions in your life and 3 fillings, all of which were conducted under circumstances that made you deeply sympathetic to anyone who'd required more extensive interventions before the current modest state of dental science. The broader medical reality is this. In 1920s Las Vegas, you were always approximately 4 hours from real medical care, which means that the most important medical strategy available to you is not getting seriously ill or injured in the first place. You do not take unnecessary physical risks. You eat adequately. You sleep as much as the climate and the workload permit. You are not a hypochondriac. You cannot afford the time, but you are a pragmatist about the body, which is, after all, the infrastructure that the rest of your operation runs on. You maintain it with the same practical attention you bring to your property and your freight contracts. Because in the desert, everything that fails costs you more than maintenance would have. There are no theatres in Las Vegas in 1922. There are no nightclubs in the modern sense. There is no radio in most homes yet. The technology is emerging but has not saturated the Nevada desert. What there is, in terms of entertainment, is people, conversation, card games, occasional travelling performers who pass through on the railroad, a pool hall, and the generative social energy of a community that has to make its own fun because the alternatives are limited and the evenings are long. You are, as it happens, an excellent card player. Not in the flashy, riverboat gambler sense, but in the patient, observational, reads people correctly sense that tends to produce consistent results over time. You host card evenings occasionally, and they are among the more genuinely enjoyable events in your social calendar. A small group, a fair table, good whiskey from your private stock, and several hours of conversation that ranges from business to gossip to philosophy, depending on how late it gets. The card evenings happen in your study, At the round table you'd brought in specifically for this purpose, the round shape being important, because a round table has no head, and the absence of a head means that the gathering is nominally egalitarian in a way that makes people more relaxed and consequently more candid. You are fully aware that the gathering is not actually egalitarian. It is your house, your whiskey, your table, and you are the richest man in the county. But the table's shape creates a productive social fiction that you find useful. People talk more freely when they believe the power differential is smaller than it is. The games are modest in their stakes by the standards of serious gambling. You're not trying to extract money from your guests. You're trying to spend an evening in the company of people whose minds are worth being around, using card play as the social mechanism for an interaction that would feel too deliberately contrived if it were organized as a pure conversation. Nevada has always had a relationship with gambling that precedes its formal legalization. The frontier economy ran on games of chance, in ways that would have troubled the temperance and morality movements if they'd had bandwidth left over from Prohibition. And in 1922, cards are played throughout the county with a cheerful regularity that the law technically frowns upon and practically ignores. Travelling entertainment arrives occasionally on the railroad. A vaudeville troupe, a musical act, a lecturer from one of the larger cities who has decided that touring the American West is either an adventure or a career rehabilitation strategy, depending on the circumstances. These events generate a social excitement in Las Vegas that is disproportionate to their scale, which is the predictable result of a community that has been managing its own entertainment needs for years and receives outside performers with the enthusiastic gratitude of people who have not been to a proper show since their last trip to the city. You attend these events because it is expected and because genuinely they are often enjoyable. You also occasionally fund them, paying the booking fee that allows a travelling act to stop in Las Vegas, rather than continuing directly to the next larger city, which is a form of community contribution that generates returns in goodwill that are difficult to quantify and consistently reliable. Your private entertainments are books, which you consume with the committed appetite of a man whose formal education ended earlier than he would have liked, and who has been self-correcting for it ever since. Your study shelves hold volumes on history, economics, engineering, biography, and the occasional novel that you read with the slightly guilty pleasure of someone who believes fiction is a luxury and enjoys luxuries more than he admits. The engineering texts are the most practically useful. You've been reading about dam construction with an attention that goes beyond casual interest. The irrigation engineering, the concrete specifications, the labour requirements. You're building in your mind a model of what the Colorado River project will require and what that requirement will mean for this valley. It is, in the end, the most entertaining thing you can imagine. A future that is not yet real, taking shape on the pages of technical literature in a study in the Nevada desert, while a ceiling fan turns overhead and the evening air begins very slowly to consider cooling down. Several times a year, the desert reminds everyone in southern Nevada exactly what it was before they arrived, and what it will return to eventually, and it does this through the mechanism of a dust storm, which arrives with minimal warning and exits whenever it feels like it, leaving everything in the valley covered in a fine reddish-brown layer of the Mojave itself. These storms are not gentle. The wind comes from the southwest with the kind of conviction that makes you understand viscerally why the indigenous peoples of this region had specific spiritual relationships with weather. It pushes through window seams and under door frames and through gaps in construction that you were not previously aware existed. Your staff has a protocol for this. Windows latched, wet cloths at the door frames, furniture moved away from exterior walls. You've lived through enough of these events to know that the protocol helps but does not solve the problem, and that in the aftermath, everything, your correspondence, your furniture, your carefully pressed linen suit hanging in the wardrobe, will be coated in a patient democratic layer of desert that makes no distinctions based on income. The dust storms of southern Nevada are called haboobs in the meteorological literature, a term that was in use in North Africa and the Middle East long before it was applied to the American Southwest, and that you learned from an engineering text and have used exactly once in conversation, to the polite bewilderment of everyone present. The locals have simpler names for them: a big blow, or just the wind, or occasionally a phrase involving profanity that accurately conveys the emotional response without attempting meteorological classification. You've adopted the local vocabulary. It is more efficient. These storms build on the horizon with a visibility that is either helpful or mocking, depending on how far you are from shelter when you notice them. On your property, you can see the brown wall building to the southwest approximately 20 minutes before it arrives, which is enough time to get the horses secured, the windows latched, the outdoor furniture moved, and yourself inside with the door closed. If you move purposefully and do not stop to observe the phenomenon with the appreciation it aesthetically deserves. You have, on more than one occasion, stopped to observe it with the appreciation it aesthetically deserves. It is remarkable to look at. A wall of reddish-brown atmosphere 400 feet high, moving across the desert floor with the unhurried confidence of something that knows it is going to win. It is also, if you're still outside when it arrives, a thoroughly unpleasant experience involving zero visibility, grit in your eyes, grit in your teeth, grit in locations that you will discover with irritation over the subsequent 48 hours. The aftermath of a dust storm is a cleaning project of considerable scale. Your housekeeper approaches post-storm cleaning with the focused intensity of someone settling a personal score, which is an attitude you find entirely appropriate given the scale of the intrusion. Every surface in the house requires attention. The kitchen receives particular scrutiny, because dust and food preparation are a combination that Agnes regards as a specific category of offence. Your study is cleaned last and most carefully, because your correspondence and your ledger books live there, and because fine desert grit in the mechanism of your pocket watch is an outcome you have experienced once and found sufficiently unpleasant to reorganize your storm protocol around. The storms come without apology and leave without ceremony. The desert does not explain itself. It does not moderate its behavior based on your schedule or your guests or the fact that you are in the middle of a negotiation with an investor from Salt Lake City who arrived this morning and who is going to discover by this evening that the place he is considering investing in occasionally attempts to bury itself. You consider this, in an entirely honest moment, one of the more useful natural demonstrations available to you in the negotiation. A man who sees a Las Vegas dust storm and still wants to put his money here is a man who has made a serious decision. Franklin, you will note at dinner, seems unbothered by the afternoon's meteorological event. You revise your assessment of Franklin slightly upward. He may be more useful than you initially concluded. You are not operating in isolation. The men who run commerce in Salt Lake City, Phoenix, and Los Angeles are aware that Las Vegas sits at the intersection of several rail lines and several very interesting opportunities, and they are watching the town with the attentive patience of people who are trying to determine whether it is worth their time to be here. Some have sent representatives, some have sent letters, One sent a nephew, which was a mistake, because the nephew was 23, inexperienced, and visibly overwhelmed by the heat, and he returned to Los Angeles after 6 weeks, having accomplished nothing beyond an excellent tan and a story about a dust storm. You have met the Salt Lake City interest twice, in hotels in that city, over dinners that cost more than most of your employees make in a month. The conversations were cordial, mutually informative, and resulted in agreements that were not written down. This is, as you have observed, how the most important agreements tend to work. The Salt Lake City interests are the ones you take most seriously, because Salt Lake City is the closest major city to Las Vegas, with the capital and organizational structure to mount a sustained intervention in the valley's economic development. The men behind these interests are not adventurers or speculators. They are bankers, railroad executives, and the kind of landowners who have been managing Western real estate since before Nevada achieved statehood, and who bring to their evaluations a patience and a methodology that you recognize as structurally similar to your own. This is simultaneously reassuring and concerning. Reassuring because men with long-time horizons tend to prefer partnership over conflict. Concerning because men with long-time horizons and significant capital can outlast almost anyone in a war of attrition, and you have no interest in finding out whether that category includes you. The first Salt Lake City dinner in 1919 was a feeling-out exercise conducted over a 4-course meal in a hotel dining room that was considerably more elaborate than anything currently available in Clark County. The men across from you were polite, well-informed, and carefully vague about their specific intentions in the Nevada desert. You were equally vague, equally polite, and marginally better informed about their actual holdings than they realized, because you had spent 2 weeks before the dinner having your assistant compile every publicly available piece of documentation about their land and business interests in the region. The dinner produced an understanding, not an agreement, not a contract, but an understanding that Las Vegas was a market worth developing, and that the people already developing it deserved consideration before outside capital attempted to replicate what they had built. The second dinner, in 1921, was more specific. The Salt Lake City interest had, in the intervening 2 years, watched the valley grow and concluded that the growth trajectory justified a more active position. They wanted to discuss the possibility of a joint freight operation, a formalized partnership on the railroad contracts that would combine your local relationships with their upstream capital and organizational reach. You listened to the proposal over the entire meal, asked questions that were more probing than they expected, and concluded the evening by thanking them for their time and telling them you would consider it seriously and respond within 90 days. You responded in 87 days with a counter-proposal that restructured the terms sufficiently that the resulting arrangement, which was eventually agreed to, resembled their original proposal primarily in its general category rather than its specifics. They agreed anyway because your local knowledge was worth more to them than the original terms were worth protecting. You have honoured this arrangement faithfully. It has been profitable for both parties. You have not, however, allowed it to become the kind of relationship where Salt Lake City's comfort requires your deference. There is a distinction between partnership and dependency, and you have maintained it with care. The Los Angeles interests are newer and louder, which reflects Los Angeles's general approach to everything. The city is growing at a pace that generates a specific kind of institutional confidence, the confidence of a place that has been right about its own future several times in a row, and has therefore concluded that its judgment about other places' futures is equally reliable. This confidence is not always warranted. You have watched Los Angeles money arrive in Nevada before. make assumptions based on California frameworks that do not apply to the desert, and exit with lessons learned at considerable expense. The nephew was the most recent example, but not the first. You do not find this pattern amusing exactly, but you do find it consistent enough to be useful. California money that arrives overconfident tends to leave quickly when the desert declines to perform on schedule. The land it leaves behind tends to be available at interesting prices. Phoenix is a different consideration, closer, more similar in climate and therefore in institutional understanding, and growing in ways that make its business community increasingly relevant to Nevada's future. The man from Phoenix currently watching Las Vegas, Gerald, has not made the mistakes of the Los Angeles nephew. He has stayed. He has asked good questions. He has adapted to the heat without complaint, which is the first test that the desert administers to everyone who arrives here with serious intentions, and which Gerald has passed. You're watching Gerald watch you, and you're doing it with the specific interest of a man who has not yet decided whether the thing approaching him is a problem or an opportunity, and who knows that the distinction matters enormously, and that the time to make it is before, not after, the answer becomes obvious. You attend services at the Methodist Church on Sunday mornings, and you have done so with reasonable consistency since arriving in Nevada, because you were raised in a household that treated Sunday attendance as a structural element of civilized life, and also because in a town this small, the social intelligence gathered at Sunday service is considerable and free. You sit in the same pew each week, 3 rows from the front right side, which positions you in the sight line of most of the congregation without placing you directly in the front row, which would suggest either extreme piety or a desire to be seen that you prefer not to project. You are generous in the collection plate. Specifically, you are more generous than anyone else in the congregation, by a margin that is known and noted, and you have funded 2 repairs to the building in the past 4 years, which the pastor mentions, in tones of genuine gratitude, more often than you strictly require. The Methodist Church of Las Vegas is a modest building, white painted wood, a modest steeple, pews that were built locally and that reflect the carpentry skills available in Clark County in 1914, which is to say they are sturdy and not particularly comfortable. The windows are clear glass rather than coloured, which means that on Sunday mornings the Nevada light enters without ceremony, flooding the interior with the same direct sun that floods everything else in the valley and lending the services a quality of unfiltered brightness that you have always found appropriate for an institution that is, in theory, in the business of clarity. The pastor is a man named Reverend Ellis, who's been in Las Vegas since 1917, and who conducts services with a warmth and a practical intelligence that you find genuinely respectable. Ellis does not preach fire and brimstone. He preaches responsibility, community, and the specific theology of showing up for your neighbours, for your family, for the collective project of making something viable in a place that the landscape has not pre-approved for habitation. You find this theology compatible with your own operational philosophy and have told him so, on the walk from the church to the street after services, in terms that were sincere enough that Ellis looked slightly surprised, which tells you that he receives more social performance than genuine agreement in his Sunday morning conversations. The social dimension of church in a town this small is inseparable from its spiritual dimension, and you have long since stopped trying to separate them. The congregation of the Methodist Church includes most of the people whose lives intersect meaningfully with yours: merchants, ranchers, railroad workers, their families, the women whose social networks run the town's charitable and educational infrastructure, and the various individuals whose presence on Sunday morning is, like yours, a combination of genuine faith and practical calculation in proportions that vary by person and that you have never thought it useful to assess to directly. People's reasons for being in church are their own business. What they do while they are there is observable. You have learned more useful things in the conversations on the church steps after services than in many formal business meetings. The church steps on Sunday morning, in the brief window between the end of services and the dispersal of the congregation to their midday meals, are where information moves freely and where the social temperature of the valley can be read with accuracy unavailable in other settings. Who is speaking to whom, who is avoiding whom, who looks worried and who looks relieved, and what the difference between those two groups tells you about the current state of everyone's various enterprises. You stand on those steps every Sunday, hat in hand, talking to people, and you have been doing it for long enough that the habit of observation is now automatic, like a background process running underneath the conversation. You believe, in the private accounting that you conduct in the quieter moments of your life, that you are a person of genuine if imperfect faith, that the moral framework of your upbringing has not been entirely compromised by the practical requirements of building a fortune in the Nevada desert, and that the things you have done in the grey areas of law and ethics have been proportionate to the circumstances and are balanced, in whatever ledger matters most, by the school, the church repairs, the families whose debts you quietly absorbed, and the consistent honouring of your word over 20 years of dealings. This accounting may be more favourable to you than an objective auditor would produce. You're aware of this. You continue the accounting anyway, because a man who stops evaluating himself has stopped managing his most important asset. Something is happening in southern Nevada, and you are aware of it before most people because awareness of incoming change is one of the skills that made you wealthy in the first place. There is talk, serious talk, not idle speculation, about the possibility of a dam on the Colorado River. Engineers from the federal government have been surveying the canyon country to the southeast. If a dam of that magnitude is built, it will require an enormous construction workforce, and that workforce will need to be housed somewhere, and the nearest somewhere with existing infrastructure is Las Vegas. You're already buying land in positions that assume this future arrives. You're not certain it will arrive. You're certain enough to act as if it might, which is, functionally, the same thing. The 1930s are still a decade away. Hoover Dam will not break ground until 1931. But in 1922, you are already thinking about where to put the worker housing. The Bureau of Reclamation has been studying the Colorado River since the early years of the century. The river floods destructively in wet years and provides almost nothing in dry ones, and the states of the Southwest have been arguing about its management and allocation with the focused passion of neighbours disputing a fence line that runs through both their properties and affects everything they grow. The Colorado River Compact, signed just this year among the 7 basin states, is the political framework for what comes next. The engineering question, how, specifically, to harness the river, has been narrowing toward a site in the canyon country that the surveys keep returning to. Boulder Canyon, or possibly Black Canyon. The surveyors have been in both. The reports are not public, but the surveyors travel on trains, and trains stop in Las Vegas, and men who have been in the desert for weeks tend to talk over dinner, and your dining room has hosted 2 of them in the past 18 months. What you know, specifically, is this. The project, if approved by Congress and funded, will require a workforce of several thousand men at peak construction. These men will need housing, food, medical care, and the full range of services that a community requires to function. Boulder City, a planned government town, will eventually be built for this purpose, but in 1922, that plan does not yet exist in any form you have encountered, and the assumption that the federal government will build and maintain a complete planned city for its construction workforce is not obviously the path of least resistance. Las Vegas, 30 miles from the proposed dam site, with existing infrastructure, existing supply chains, and an existing population with experience in the logistics of desert living, is the natural service centre for whatever arrives. You have purchased, in the past 2 years, 4 parcels of land in the northern part of the valley at prices that reflect their current agricultural value rather than their potential development value. 2 of these parcels are adjacent to the road that connects Las Vegas to the canyon country, to the southeast, the road that construction traffic would travel if construction begins. You have not improved these parcels. Improvement is premature. Improvement communicates intention, and communicated intention raises prices on the land you have not yet purchased and that you intend to. You are in the middle of the buying phase, which requires that the market not yet understand what it is you are buying and why. The other thing coming, slower, less dramatic, but equally certain, is the growth of Las Vegas itself, independent of the dam. The railroad brings people. People require services. Services require infrastructure. Infrastructure requires capital and organization, and the kind of long-term commitment to a place that most arriving investors lack and that you have been providing through your holdings and your presence and your 20 years of accumulated relationships since before most of the current population of Las Vegas arrived. The town will grow because towns at railroad intersections in developing regions grow. The question is not whether it will grow, but who will be positioned to benefit from the growth. And the answer to that question is being written right now, in land purchases and freight contracts and dinner conversations, and the careful, patient work of a man who arrived in the Nevada desert in 1904 and decided, for reasons that were partly rational and partly something closer to conviction, that this was the place. You are not certain about any of this. You are certain enough. And in the Nevada desert, certainty enough, combined with capital and patience and the willingness to act before the outcome is obvious, is what separates the people who build things from the people who later explain why they almost did. Dinner at your table is, by the standards of the American West in the 1920s, a genuinely impressive affair, and you have never pretended otherwise. Your cook prepares a proper meal each evening, roasted meat when available, fresh bread, vegetables from the small irrigated garden behind the house, preserved goods from your mercantile when fresh is not an option, and a dessert that is taken more seriously than most diplomatic documents in this county. You eat at a set time. You sit at the head of a table that seats 8, and there are, more nights than not, at least 2 or 3 guests, a business associate, a man passing through on the railroad, a neighbor with news, occasionally an official from the county seat who's come to discuss something that requires a proper meal to properly negotiate. The table is where things get decided, not formally, not in writing, but in the course of conversation over good food and the specific kind of candor that settles over people when they're full and comfortable. The real terms of the real arrangements tend to emerge. Tonight the table seats 5, Franklin, the Salt Lake City investor, at your right. His associate, a quieter man named Matthias, who arrived on the same train, and who has said perhaps 40 words since his arrival, but who listens with the focused quality of someone being paid specifically to remember things, across from Franklin. The town's mayor, a man named Robert, who serves the function of official municipal legitimacy in conversations that benefit from having a title present, at your left. And Douglas, the competing general store owner, whom you have invited with the specific intention of demonstrating to Franklin that you are secure enough in your position to socialize comfortably with your competition, which is the kind of signal that investors find reassuring and that costs you nothing to send because you are, in fact, secure enough. Delbert has produced a roast pork with root vegetables, a bean dish that has been cooking since morning, sourdough bread with a crust that requires the kind of commitment that builds character, and an apple cake that was under preparation when you passed through the kitchen at midday, and that has been the subject of low-level anticipation for the subsequent 6 hours. The whiskey is on the sideboard, the water pitcher is at the table, the temperature outside has finally descended to something approaching reasonable, and the ceiling fan in the dining room is performing its function with the reliable efficiency of something that has no ambitions beyond its immediate purpose. Dinner conversation in your house moves through phases that you have learned to read and, where useful, to direct. The early conversation is social, travel, the weather, the dust storm, Franklin's impressions of the valley, Robert's update on the town board's recent discussions about the road improvements that have been under discussion for approximately 3 years without producing road improvements. This phase serves the function of allowing people to settle, to consume some food, to feel that the evening is an enjoyment rather than a transaction. You participate fully in this phase because you genuinely enjoy it, and because the enjoyment is visible in ways that make people relax in ways that are useful later. The middle phase of the conversation is where the substantive material begins to surface, not through formal agenda, but through the natural gravitational pull of what everyone at the table is actually thinking about. Franklin steers toward the land parcel, as expected, raising the subject with the practiced casualness of a man who's been waiting to raise it since the morning train. You receive the subject with an openness that is genuine and a specific reticence about numbers that is not, and you allow the conversation to circle the question of valuation without landing on it, which is a technique that works best over a meal, because the continued arrival of food provides natural interruptions that reset the conversational pressure whenever it builds toward a conclusion you're not yet ready to reach. By the apple cake, the evening has achieved the specific quality you were aiming for. Franklin is more relaxed than when he arrived, better informed about the valley's trajectory, and more invested emotionally in the idea of this particular deal than he was this morning, while the actual terms remain unresolved. Matthias has said perhaps 60 words in total, and you have mentally noted each one, because 60 words from a professional listener are 60 words chosen with some care. Robert has contributed the municipal perspective with his characteristic enthusiasm and his characteristic imprecision, which is exactly what you needed from him tonight. Douglas has been charming, relaxed, and has demonstrated by his mere comfortable presence at your table that the competitive landscape of Las Vegas is not a war zone but a functioning community, which is the message you needed Franklin to absorb. The dinner has accomplished everything you planned. Delbert's apple cake has accomplished the rest. You raise a small glass of the Kentucky bourbon to no one in particular, and you drink it, and it is very good, and the evening air coming through the dining room window is almost cool. And so ends a single day in the life of the richest man in 1920s Las Vegas, a day that began with a rooster who had no respect for your schedule and ended under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled the entire contents of the universe across the Nevada dark and decided to leave it. You survived the heat, which was not subtle about its intentions. You navigated a negotiation over pork roast and apple cake, and did not flinch when the dust storm arrived uninvited and redecorated everything you owned in a uniform shade of Mojave. You managed Harold, which deserves its own category of recognition. You wrote your letters. You checked the lock twice. You stood on your porch in the cooling air of a desert night and looked out at a valley that was, in 1922, mostly sand and stubbornness, and the specific kind of ambition that flourishes in places that everyone else has dismissed. It was not a glamorous life, exactly. It was grand in its own terms, the best house in the county, the finest bourbon in the state, the ledger books that told a story of 20 years of careful compounding decisions. But it was also a pump instead of a tap, a ceiling fan instead of cool air, a doctor 4 hours away, and a dentist who arrived twice a year in a wagon. It was a life built in a place the landscape had not pre-approved, by a man who looked at the desert and saw something that wasn't there yet, and decided to build it anyway. The people who built Las Vegas in those early decades, not the casino moguls and the showgirls that history remembers most vividly, but the merchants and the ranchers and the railroad men and the women who ran their households and their communities with extraordinary competence in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. They did it without air conditioning, without reliable medicine, without the infrastructure that we treat as the minimum acceptable baseline for a functioning life. They did it in the heat, in the dust, in the specific social intimacy of a town where everyone knew everything and forgot nothing. And they did it with a stubbornness that the desert, for all its conviction, could not outlast. So tonight, as you lie in your very comfortable bed, in your temperature-controlled room, with your reliable plumbing and your functional healthcare system, and your ability to order anything you need from anywhere in the world, and have it arrive without a 4-hour train journey, maybe take one quiet moment to acknowledge the people who built things in places that weren't ready for them yet. They were not always admirable, they were not always right, but they showed up, and they stayed, and they built, and because they did, the impossible places became possible ones. The desert is patient, the stars are still there, and somewhere in the Nevada dark of 1922, The richest man in Las Vegas has finally fallen asleep, with tomorrow already beginning to assemble itself outside his window, patient and warm and full of things that will need his attention. Rest now. The rooster is not your problem tonight. You have nowhere to be until morning, and morning for once can wait.